October 25, 2018. 3:30 in the morning. A Filipino soldier is lying prone on the third floor of a building that no longer has a roof, in a city that no longer has a civilian population, in a country that has been watching the longest and most destructive urban battle in its modern history grind through its 146th consecutive day with no end visibly approaching. His name, for the purposes of this investigation, is Corporal Diego. His real identity is protected by the Philippine military for reasons that will become clear before this story is finished. He has been in this position for hours. Motionless. Scope up. Breathing controlled. Watching an intersection 800 meters away through a night vision optic in total darkness, because Philippine intelligence has told him that tonight, specifically tonight, in the early hours before dawn, the two men whose continued survival have prolonged this siege and kept 200,000 people from returning to their homes are going to attempt to escape. Isnalan Hapalon. Omar Kayam Moute. The operational commanders of the ISIS-linked forces that seized Marawi city on May 23, 2018, declared it the capital of an Islamic state in Southeast Asia, and then discovered that the Philippine military was not going to allow that declaration to stand. Corporal Diego has one assignment. One intersection. One chance. He waits. To understand what Corporal Diego was doing on that rooftop at 3 in the morning, you need to understand what happened to Marawi city on May 23, 2018, and why the Philippine military's response to it became the defining military engagement of a generation. Marawi is the largest Muslim-majority city in the Philippines, a city with its own culture, its own architecture, its own specific place in the national identity of Filipino Muslims who have called the shores of Lake Lanao home for centuries. On May 23, fighters from the Moute group and Abu Sayyaf, both formerly affiliated with the Islamic State, stormed the city in coordinated, simultaneous assaults across multiple entry points. They had been planning the operation for months. They had prepositioned weapons, ammunition, and supplies inside the city. They had identified sympathizers within the population who could provide cover and intelligence. And they had a specific, documented, publicly announced objective: to declare Marawi the first territorial capital of an Islamic state in Southeast Asia, a foothold from which the ISIS project, which was being militarily dismantled in Iraq and Syria at exactly this moment, could establish a new front in a new region. The Philippine military was caught in a posture it was not immediately prepared for. What followed was 5 months of the most intense urban combat the Philippines had seen since the Second World War. The Philippine military's initial response to the Marawi siege exposed something that military analysts would spend years documenting and debating: the gap between the force structure the armed forces of the Philippines have been optimized for and the force structure that urban combat against a well-armed, well-trained, ideologically motivated enemy using civilian infrastructure as both cover and shield actually required. The AFP had spent decades configured primarily for counterinsurgency operations in rural and jungle terrain. Marawi was something different. The Moute group fighters were not a guerrilla force making contact and withdrawing. They were a conventional defensive force dug into the dense, multi-story urban environment of a city they had spent months studying, booby-trapping, and preparing to hold for as long as their ammunition and personnel allowed. Every street was a potential kill zone. Every building contained unknown threats. Every advance required the kind of deliberate, methodical, costly room-by-room clearance that turns military operations into attritional contests of will and casualties rather than momentum and maneuver. The AFP adapted. Armor was brought in. Artillery was coordinated. Close air support from OV-10 Bronco attack aircraft was integrated into the ground advance. And specialized units, among them the Light Reaction Company, the AFP's Tier 1 Direct Action Force, were deployed into the most contested areas of the city. Corporal Diego was one of them. The battle for Bato Mosque was one of the bloodiest single engagements of the entire 5-month siege, and it is the engagement that most directly shaped the soldier Corporal Diego had become by the time he found himself on that rooftop in October. Bato Mosque sat inside territory that the Moute group had fortified with a specific knowledge that its religious and architectural significance would constrain the Philippine military's use of direct fire and air assets against it, a calculation that was militarily sound and morally grotesque in equal measure. The Marines who went into that fight knew what they were entering. They went anyway. In the space of a single ambush inside the mosque compound, 13 Marines were killed. In Philippine military history, in a single engagement, that is a catastrophic casualty event. The men who died there were not statistics, and this investigation will not treat them as statistics. They were professional soldiers who understood the risk calculus of their profession and accepted it in service of a mission they believed in. Their deaths hardened the resolve of the units around them in the way that the deaths of respected colleagues always harden the resolve of professional soldiers, not into recklessness, but into the particular, focused, cold determination that replaces the initial shock of serious loss when there is still a mission to complete and no one available to complete it but the people still standing. At some point during the Marawi siege, the specific date is not in any public record and Corporal Diego has not shared it publicly for reasons that are easy to understand. Something changed in how he carried the mission. It was not a dramatic conversion or a visible breakdown. It was quieter than that. He had been in a position one morning when a fellow soldier moved to take his spot at a firing point. The kind of routine tactical rotation that happens dozens of times a day in urban combat without anyone tracking it or noting it. Seconds after that soldier took the position that Diego had just vacated, a jihadist sniper's round found it. The soldier was hit. Diego was not. The margin between the two outcomes was measured in seconds, and in the particular, arbitrary, completely unchosen fact of which body was in which place at which moment. He began praying after that. Before each mission and after each mission, not as a performance and not as a ritual that anyone else needed to observe, but as a private acknowledgement between himself and whatever force he believed had arranged for him to still be present when the mathematics of his situation suggested other outcomes were equally possible. The prayers became part of his operational rhythm. They did not make him less effective. Evidence suggests they made him more focused. By the time October 2018 arrived, the human arithmetic of the Marawi siege had reached dimensions that demanded accounting in the plainest possible terms. 160 Filipino soldiers and Marines had been killed in action. Professional military personnel, men who had trained for combat and accepted its risks, whose deaths nonetheless represented 160 families permanently altered and 160 futures permanently foreclosed. 774 militants had been killed, a number that reflected the scale of the force the Maute Group and Abu Sayyaf had deployed and the effectiveness of the Philippine military's response once it had adapted to the terrain and the tactics it was facing. 47 civilians had been murdered by the militants, killed not in crossfire but deliberately, as a calculated element of an occupation strategy that treated the city's Muslim population not as the community it claimed to be liberating but as a resource to be consumed in service of an ideological project imported from the other side of the world. 200,000 people remained displaced from their homes. The city they had left was not the city that would be waiting for them when they returned. The physical Marawi, the built environment of generations, had been destroyed to a degree that made reconstruction not a repair project but an act of construction from the ground up. And through all of this, through 5 months of the most intense combat in modern Philippine history, Hapilon and Maute were still alive. Still commanding. Still inside the city. Still holding hostages. Philippine military intelligence, working through the combination of signals collection, human intelligence from sources inside the remaining militant-held area, and the pattern analysis of 5 months of documented Maute Group operational behavior, established two critical facts in the second week of October 2018. The first was the location of Hapilon and Maute's current position within the drastically reduced footprint of territory that the militants still held. The second was their plan. On the night of October 15th into the early hours of October 16th, the two leaders and their remaining personal security detail were going to attempt to break out of the encirclement and reach Lake Lanio, where water transport and the possibility of dispersion into the surrounding region offered their best remaining chance of survival and continued operational capacity. The intelligence assessment was specific enough about timing and route that the military had actionable options. A trap was designed. The intersection that the escape route had to pass through, the only viable corridor between the militants' last known position and the lake, was identified. A firing position covering that intersection at the required range was assessed and selected. And Corporal Diego, whose record over 5 months of the most demanding urban combat the AFP had conducted in the modern era had established him as the unit's most reliable precision shooter under pressure, was assigned to it. At 3 in the morning on October 16th, Corporal Diego saw them. Not immediately. Not as identified individuals with confirmed identities that intelligence had already attached to faces he was trained to recognize. First as movement. The kind of movement that a trained observer distinguishes from the random shifting of debris and the play of shadow that an urban combat environment generates constantly as visual noise. Purposeful movement. Grouped. Moving in the direction and along the route that the intelligence brief had told him to watch for. He tracked. He confirmed. The lead figure in the group matched the physical profile and the movement pattern associated with Hapalon in the intelligence package he had been briefed on. The second figure matched Maute. His breathing slowed in the way that trained shooters describe, not a conscious decision, but the body executing the physiological protocol that months of training have installed at a level below conscious direction. 800 meters. In darkness. Through a night optic. Against moving targets who were aware they were in a hostile environment and were moving with a trained, unpredictable pattern variation of people who understood what exposure meant. He placed the reticle. He made his calculation. He pressed the trigger. The lead figure went down. Without breaking his position, without the pause that an untrained shooter takes to process what has just happened, he shifted to the second target and fired again. 5 hours after Corporal Diego fired those 2 shots, Philippine ground forces moving through the area confirmed what the intelligence assessment had predicted and the sniper's execution had delivered. Isnilon Hapalon, the designated leader of ISIS in Southeast Asia, the man whose presence in Marawi had given the siege its international significance and its ideological dimension, was dead. Omar Khayyam Maute, the operational commander of the Maute group, the man whose family network had financed and organized the seizure of a Philippine city in the name of a caliphate, was dead. Without its command structure, without the leadership that had sustained the militants' will to hold their position through 5 months of military pressure that had destroyed most of the force around them, the remaining fighters lost the coherent direction that had made them effective. The Philippine military pressed the advantage. On October 23, 2018, 153 days after the first shots were fired on May 23, President Rodrigo Duterte declared the liberation of Marawi City. The last militants were killed. The hostages they had been holding, civilians who had survived 5 months of captivity inside a combat zone, were freed. The Battle of Marawi was over. The ISIS project in Southeast Asia had been denied its territorial foothold. 2 shots, fired by 1 soldier at 800 meters, in total darkness, had made that ending possible. Corporal Diego was not the only hero this investigation is obligated to document. Among the 160 soldiers and Marines killed during the Marawi siege, 1 death produced an act of valor that the Philippine military recognized with the highest decoration it is authorized to award. Corporal Reyes of the Philippine Marines was engaged in combat operations during one of the most contested phases of the battle when a fellow Marine was struck by enemy fire and left wounded and exposed in a position that could not be reached without crossing ground covered by active militant fire. Corporal Reyes made the assessment that his comrade could not survive without immediate extraction and that the fire covering the extraction route was not a reason to leave him there. He moved into the exposed ground. He reached his wounded fellow Marine. He was pulling him back toward cover when the fire found him. He died in the act of completing the extraction, which means his comrade survived because of what he chose to do and how he chose to spend the final minutes of his life. The Philippine military awarded Corporal Reyes the Medal of Valor posthumously. The medal goes to his family, who received it in a ceremony at which the soldier it was meant for was represented by his photograph, his uniform, and the specific, permanent silence of a man who is no longer present to be recognized for what he did. Corporal Diego lives with the consequences of what he did on the morning of October 16, 2018, in ways that no medal ceremony and no public recognition will ever be able to address, because there is no public recognition. His identity remains classified. The Philippine military has assessed that making his name known would place him in permanent, specific danger from the networks affiliated with the men he killed and the ideology those men represented. He is, by the formal determination of the institution he serves, a hero who cannot be a hero in any visible or public sense for as long as the threat assessment remains what it is. He goes to work. He lives his life. He looks over his shoulder in the specific, practiced, permanent way that people who understand what they are being careful about look over their shoulders, not with fear, exactly, but with a calibrated, sustained vigilance of someone who made a decision that cannot be unmade and that carries consequences that do not expire. The Battle of Marawi demonstrated something that the world needed demonstrated in 2018, that ISIS could not simply declare a caliphate in Southeast Asia and expect it to stand. It demonstrated it at a cost of 160 Filipino soldiers, 47 murdered civilians, and a city that 200,000 people are still in the process of rebuilding. Corporal Diego is the reason it is finished. His name, for now, belongs only to the people who were there. He ended the siege. You will never know his name. Watch next, the Visconde Massacre, the case that still has no answer. Subscribe to the Filipino narrative, the stories that demand to be told.